A quick note before we get into the episode. Oversharing is a podcast for entertainment purposes only. It is not a medical podcast and does not constitute medical or psychological advice. Always seek the advice of your physician or mental health professional.
Welcome back to Baby Steps, and I am so excited to have Professor Emily Oster back on for another episode. Welcome back.
Thank you.
So in our first episode of the season, we talked about everything to know if you're just starting to try to conceive. We dispelled a lot of TikTok myths. We went through all the lifestyle stuff. And I think we did a pretty comprehensive job of breaking down what we need to focus on.
No one is watching TikTok anymore. So I think we did our job.
Exactly. Everyone has deleted TikTok. We've saved the world. I think there's conventional advice for like trying to get pregnant. And then sometimes things get more complicated. And if you're someone like me, you can be like, okay, like I did all those things and like things aren't working. And like now where do I go? Because there's so much out there that's just about like people who have seemingly normal, straightforward cycles, and I don't seem to be one of them.
Yeah.
And that's why I loved, you were on last year when your book, The Unexpected, came out, which is out now in paperback.
Yeah.
If you haven't read it yet and you're listening to this episode and you were one of the people like me, it's definitely a great place to start in terms of pregnancy complications.
Yes. Yeah. So in that book, we really talk through pregnancy complications, what to understand about them, and then how to approach those conversations with your doctor, which I think is like such an important part of what happens when things don't go like you expect. And then you're like faced with, okay, well, now my experience is not the like middle of the road typical thing. How do I have the best experience that I can given the medical issues I'm facing?
And I think a big question, I think for those of us with more complicated experiences is like, how do I use the data to help me when I seem to be like in the statistical minority of a lot of the data?
Yeah, and I think that's really tough. And some of it is sort of taking, what are the pieces of the data that might be relevant, but then also more than that, saying like, what are the questions I want to ask my doctor? Like, what are the things I need to understand to move forward? I feel like so many of those conversations, and we try to work through this in The Unexpected, are about like, why did this happen to me?
Right.
As opposed to what can I do to make it happen differently next time.
Exactly. And I think that's where like the data comes in, because the data can't really change the past, but like it can probably give you more knowledge to work with going forward to try to figure out the best route for you personally.
Exactly.
I also want to talk about the fertility trying to conceive vertical that you have, which goes into pregnancy complications. You can ask PD, the AI chatbot, questions about maybe less common, straightforward fertility questions. So I think that's such a great resource for someone who's, again, looking on TikTok for their answers, or in a Reddit thread with well-meaning but maybe sometimes unhelpful opinions.
Yeah. Yeah. So in the parent data vertical about trying to conceive, we have a lot of stuff on infertility. And I think one piece that I want for people there is to be able to go and find someplace where you can just like first get the basics of like, okay, I want to make sure I understand like what happens in IVF. Like, we hear about this all the time, but like let me make sure I have exactly the context for like, what are the options? What is the set of things that's going to happen when I show up for a fertility appointment? And then a place to ask the questions like, what's the evidence really say on, the impacts of stress or the impacts of supplements or the impacts of all the other things I'm seeing, and a place to get something other than TikTok or Reddit, something with facts.
Right. Yes, facts, exactly.
Facts.
And I think a lot of the times some of the fertility treatments that you see are sort of, they're presented as like guarantees, or they're presented as, cure-alls, when I think when you look closer into the data, that's not necessarily the case. And I think it's helpful to go into these things with good expectations, which is, I think, where the data comes in handy.
Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, I wish that we could say like, when you really look at the data, like here is the way you get to 100%, because that is what people are looking for, right? That is why this is so appealing on TikTok. It's why it's so clickable. But I think the reality is sometimes more discouraging than that. But it also helps us make the right decisions, which is the thing that is going to maximize your probability of success, even if you can't get it to 100%.
Yeah, I think the ideal scenario would be go to a website and find out, like, is there 100% probability that if I do this long enough, is it going to happen for me? And that doesn't really exist.
It doesn't really exist.
But it can help you, have as much control in statistics as you can
give yourself the best chance,
right,
to make it work.
And I also want to, we're going to have on in a later episode someone else who's on your team. And can you tell us about the LGBTQ+ vertical that you have? Because I know you were saying this is one of the most comprehensive places for that kind of information on the internet.
So Maria Goodman has written really a large corpus of information of pieces about family formation sort of in non-traditional ways. And so a lot of this is relevant for the LGBTQ plus community, but also for people who are building families, with just one person or, anything outside of the, there is a partner with a vagina and a partner with a penis and they're planning to come together using those two things to produce a baby. Anything else, there are a lot of other decisions that you want to make there, thinking about, donor sperm, donor eggs, different kinds of surrogate, reciprocal IVF. There's tons of option space here. And almost sometimes in those situations, Maria writes about this really well, there can be almost an embarrassment of options. We have like 2 uteruses. Like anyway, we have 2 uteruses and 2 sets of eggs. Like what, that's great. That's so many options, but also, requires choices. And so I'm really excited that we have that to help people kind of start in those journeys with a little bit more control.
For sure. And we are going to have them on at in a few weeks, so you can hear all in our episode.
Yes, they're amazing. They are totally
I'm really
fantastic.
excited.
Yes,
yeah.
They're
And
great.
we are
You're
going
gonna love.
We're going to dig really into the data as it pertains to sort of like alternative methods of fertility in that space. Okay. So I mean, we already talked about kind of like how long you should wait before getting an intervention in like the fertility space. And we were talking about how a lot of it depends on your age.
Yeah.
So I think there's this idea, and I think there's almost like 2 schools of thought on the 40 plus conception story. And I think some of them is like, you see like, oh, there's you hear a lot of this data of like, I don't know about data, but you hear a lot of these stories, but more women are having kids over 40 than ever before. I think they said like 10% of, is it right? Was it 10% in New York or 10%?
Yeah, I think it's in New York. I think that's not overall, but yeah, it's gone up so much over time.
Right. So
teenagers stopped having babies and women in their 40s are having more.
Yeah, basically. The teenagers' moms are now having more babies in their 40s. And I think you hear data like that, and for someone who's maybe in their late 30s or early 40s, you're like, okay, like I'm going to be fine. Mm-hmm. But then you also, I mean, we've talked about this on the last episode, that it is also statistically true that the older you are when you're trying to have kids, the more difficult it is. And I mean, you see the success stories, you see the Hillary Swank has twins at 48 story more like often in the news, but you don't really see like all the behind the scenes to get there.
Yeah, I mean, the chance for someone who is sort of in their early 40s from 40, the chance of conceiving naturally in a given cycle is about 5%.
Oh, wow.
And so it's low. And that number would be more like 30% in your kind of late 20s. So,
and when you say conceiving naturally, does that mean like with a live birth or just like any kind of pregnancy?
Conceiving a pregnancy that contain conceiving a pregnancy.
So just like
detect, yes.
So just having like a clinical pregnancy.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's not even, I assume then the number of like live births
would be lower than
over
that.
40 naturally is even lower than that.
Yeah. So those numbers, it's not, I think there's a both and to this, which is like that number is not 0. Whereas, that number, if you're 55, is 0. Like people are not conceiving.
What age is the number 0? 55?
So at some point you hit menopause. It's sort of like defined as like a year after your last period. So it's a sort of retrospective look.
Okay.
But for most people, that's 50 or 51. And so, after that point, the chance is 0. For about 25% of women, their last cycle is an ovulatory cycle. So like in principle, you could get pregnant. The chance of a chromosomal abnormality at that age would be very, very high. So there isn't, it's only at menopause when it's really 0. It goes down a lot over your 40s. So it's not 0 at 40, but it's low. And that number is the reason that people are often advised, if you are going to start trying to conceive after 40, see your doctor immediately. Okay. And not because that necessarily means we're immediately going to do IVF, but you want to have some testing done to see, how are things looking? The chance that you're going to have trouble is higher. And so acknowledging that, figuring out, okay, does it seem like I have eggs? Does it seem like everything is, operating? Is my partner's sperm working in the way it should? At least that will give you the best chance of sort of starting out and trying and getting to that 5%. And then you're also in a better position if you do want to pivot to another kind of assisted reproductive technology.
Okay. So you're saying most of the 10% of women that are getting pregnant in their 40s are, we would assume, using
probably a
Younger
reasonable
eggs?
share. I think we don't have I'm not sure that we have. It's an interesting question. I don't think that we have in the data information that would tell you what share of births to people over 40 are assisted reproductive technology, but we might have that. Not at all, but we may have like some information about what share of births are IVF in that age group.
Okay.
I don't know.
And does it matter if you're like a healthy 40 or if you're like a less so? Like, does that really affect your chance? Like, if you feel like you're 40, but you feel like you're as healthy as a 28-year-old, does that actually matter?
I don't believe we have data about whether that matters. There are certainly, there certainly is going to be variation across people, but whether it's associated with like, your 5K time or something, I don't think there's good evidence on that.
Okay. And then can I ask, why is that like, okay, we're born with the amount of eggs. Do the eggs just like go bad? Do they like rot? Yeah. Or like they do? Okay.
Yeah. Rot is a little strong, but yeah, they over time, they pick up, they sort of pick up mutations basically. And so
just due to time.
Yeah. And so then they're more likely. So this sort of difference in fertility is basically all about these sort of differences in chromosomal abnormalities in the egg. And so some of those, sometimes we will see that. So it's like an increased risk of Down syndrome or one of the more common trisomies. But there are many other chromosomal abnormalities where you simply would never get a fertilization or you would never get to the point of, the egg dividing. Mm-hmm. And that is also going up as you get older because the eggs have just been around longer and they've had more time to pick up errors.
Got it. Okay. And what about, I've heard a lot about like autism and age. Is there a correlation between that or your father's age or something like that?
There's a relationship between both maternal and paternal age and autism diagnoses. It's very difficult to figure out how much of that is actually a result of sort of a causal impact of parental age as opposed to a difference in diagnosis. So this sort of gets much deeper into the question of like, why have autism rates gone up over time? In general, a lot of that, very large share. Is it all? Hard to say, but a very large share of that is about changes in diagnosis. People who are having kids older tend to be people with more access to resources, more access to doctors, a higher chance of a kid being diagnosed conditional on a set of symptoms. And so separating out, does age actually impact these symptoms as opposed to just impacting diagnosis? That's a tricky question.
That's very interesting and not something I've like really heard before in terms of people unpacking that data. Because people want it feels like people want a rule, right? Or like a straight, like non-nuanced statistical fact of like older, more chance, like older bad, younger good, like, or like older, issues, younger no issues. And I think
and they want to cut off. Like people want something, they want to cut off. And like with many of these things, it's like there's no cutoff. Mm-hmm. And it's really complicated in part because there's kind of a reason many people wait, which is because of resources and because of other things. And so actually conditional on, you may be hard to get pregnant, but you may be better equipped to have a kid, and all of those things fight against each other.
But it is, I asked people to submit their questions and someone said, is pregnancy possible after 40?
Absolutely. It's absolutely possible.
Without frozen eggs.
Yeah, absolutely possible to get pregnant at 40 without frozen eggs.
Is it like 5%?
But it's low.
Yeah.
It's low. I mean, it's not as easy as it was before, but it is possible.
As it was when you were younger.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And let's talk about that like 35-year-old cliff. That's not really
There's no 35-year-old cliff. I mean, on the sort of glass half full, glass half empty here is like, your fertility is kind of highest in like your early 20s, late teens, and then it's on a sort of slow rocket down to menopause. And so it was easier to get pregnant at 27 than at 30, than at 32, than at 35, but there isn't some cliff at 35.
Okay.
It just keeps declining from there.
So if you're 34, you don't have to look at 35 as some like doomsday.
No, and I think that's a crazy, like we've sort of given people this impression like somehow like, the day you turn 35, your eggs are just like, that's enough. Thanks very much for playing. It's just like absolutely not the way.
Cashing in their 401k. And let's talk about like, early stage kind of like thoughts or feelings like there might be an issue. Like, so someone writes, does having a short luteal phase impact your chances of conception?
So the luteal phase is second phase of the menstrual cycle, and it would typically be sort of 14-ish days, and sometimes people talk about if that phase is shorter than 10 days, that might not be enough time to support the implantation of a pregnancy.
Okay.
And that I think there is some evidence in that direction, and so if your luteal phase is very short, is an example of something where you probably want to go talk to your doctor before you try to conceive, just to see if there is something going on. And there are various tests they can do at different times in the cycle to sort of see how things are going. Some people think they have a short luteal phase, but actually what's short is the beginning phase, right? So some people's cycles are 21 days and they ovulate on day 7.
Is that better?
That's fine. That's
fine.
there's sort of how long it takes you to ovulate does not seem to relate.
It's more important the length
part.
of the luteal
Exactly.
phase than the follicular phase.
Yes.
Okay. And what about super long? Is that also kind of an
Again, probably that doesn't come up as much. If you have a very long cycle, it is probably because you have a very long follicular phase.
issue? Okay.
If you have a 35-day cycle, you're probably ovulating
right
on day 21.
And I would imagine the major issue with that would just be less chances.
You just don't have as much time.
Right.
Exactly. If you have a cycle every 21 days, you get a lot of shots in a given year. You have a cycle 35 days, you don't have as many shots in a given year.
Got it. But the cycle length in itself is
normal
not an
cycles
issue.
vary between 21 and 35 days.
The short luteal phase might be something to look at.
I think this is a general sort of coming in. I know we talked more about this in the last episode in this, but a sort of general thing about sort of coming into the attempt to conceive in the first place is it is a good opportunity to take stock of where your cycle is. Does it seem like you are having a standard ovulatory follicular phase, luteal phase cycle that is consistent, and you see signs of ovulation however you're looking for them? If you have that coming into your pregnancy, into your attempt to get pregnant, you are going to have a better shot than if you don't have that. And so when you are in the process of evaluating that, if you come and you're okay, look, I've been looking for ovulation, but I haven't seen any signs of ovulation for several months, or I've been, doing this and I realize my luteal phase is, 7 days. That is an opportunity to talk to your doctor before you start trying and say, hey, I'm concerned about this. Can we give me the best chance possible? Can we evaluate what's going on?
Is there anything you can do to prevent a chromosomal abnormality miscarriage besides not being over a certain age?
No, and I think it's really, really important to tell people, about 90% of miscarriages in the first trimester are a result of a chromosomal abnormality. And other than your age, there is no way to control those things.
So there's nothing
There's
you
just
can do
nothing
besides
you can
trying
do
earlier.
Besides trying earlier.
Right.
Yeah, that's it.
Which again, you can't really
do control in the moment. And so I think it's both important to say that, because that's true, but also because this is a stage at which people blame themselves so much for, I did this, I had this, I had an airhead, I had, a second glass of champagne, whatever it is. And so much of this is just out of your control.
I mean, I guess the tough thing is it's hard to know if you're saying most cases of a miscarriage are a chromosomal abnormality.
Yes.
But they don't really test.
They don't test.
Yeah.
I think if you have had in the place where, people would do some testing is if you have had 2 or 3 miscarriages, even in the first trimester. Again, it's very likely that is just, multiple random issues of chromosomal abnormalities. There are a small number of other things, and we talk more about this in the unexpected, a small number of other things which could cause an increased risk of miscarriage, which are worth evaluating if you have had 2 or 3 early miscarriages. There are some testing that you can do to see, is there something else going on that potentially be treatable.
Is there any merit to advising testing a first miscarriage, or do you think that that's unnecessary?
Generally, people will not test a first miscarriage because it is just so common. At least 25%, possibly as high as 50%, depending on when you count conception from, of pregnancies end in miscarriage.
Right.
And that just means if a lot of people are going to have a miscarriage.
And is that number increasing, or is that number pretty standard?
That number is dependent on age.
Okay.
So as people
can you control for age in that?
Yeah, you can control for age. And so the question of is it increasing over time? I
think there's part of it that's okay, you can test much earlier than you used to.
Right. Exactly. So I think that the two things that mean we see way more miscarriages are that people are getting pregnant older and that we can test immediately. Right. So in a sort of a historical time period in which you didn't know you were pregnant until you missed several periods. And in fact, we didn't even consider people pregnant until the baby started to move. Well,
Right.
there's a lot fewer miscarriages after 20 weeks than before. Now that you can test, 6 days before your missed period, that's there. We're going to detect a lot more miscarriages, and that's
Right.
like. But I don't think we have much evidence that the actual rate of loss has gone up.
Okay.
Other than the age and the
Right. Then
detection.
people conceiving later, which then leads itself into that. All right. Someone asks, how do I track ovulation accurately if I have PCOS or irregular periods? Does having PCOS mean I should automatically see a fertility doctor, or can I manage this myself?
You should automatically see a fertility doctor, or at least talk to your OB, because it may well be the case that you can manage it yourself. But if you are actively trying, this is a cause of some substantial amount of infertility. And so talking to someone to make sure you give yourself the best chance before you start trying is a good idea. PCOS definitely often leads to unpredictable ovulation. This is where techniques to track your ovulation to make sure you're having sex at the right time can be very helpful. The ring, these different kinds of apps, checking your cervical mucus, peeing on the ovulation sticks, all of these things can be very useful they're especially useful if you have such irregular cycles.
Right. And to bring it back to our last episode, these are the things where there's more lifestyle or tracking things that are more helpful as it relates to tracking your ovulation and getting to figure out when you're ovulating. Okay. So you would suggest if you have PCOS,
I would talk to your
earlier
OB before,
intervention.
absolutely.
What are some of the reasons behind secondary infertility? Because a lot of people write in and they're like, I had a super easy first pregnancy, no issues. It worked on my first time, and now the second one's kind of a nightmare. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, there's a few things going on. So one is, people vary, and fertility is kind of a noisy process, and so some of secondary infertility is actually it is not as easy to get pregnant as you thought. You got a good draw on the first one.
Okay.
And then it is harder. It's harder the second time. You don't get as good a draw. There's an element of randomness. And among people who are, it sort of goes off. It's a converse of the other thing, where somebody goes through a ton of, maybe goes all the way through IVF for their first pregnancy, and then unexpectedly gets pregnant naturally with a second kid.
Right. It could be the opposite.
It could be the opposite.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's sort of it could be the opposite. Second thing is that people are older, and age impacts fertility.
Right, yes.
I know you're tired of me saying that. And the third thing is, I think there's a piece of this, which is because you are chasing after a small person now, people don't have sex as much.
Interesting.
And they don't have so there's a sort of the secondary
Yeah.
infertility, which is I really am trying and it's not working. And then there's secondary infertility, which is well, worked so fast last time. And it was yeah, but we were having sex every day.
Right. Yeah.
And now it's hard to find the time, and things are so we're we're just not trying as hard. Right. I'm not trying as hard. So I think all three of those things.
And then
play
what about
some role?
If there's a delivery, is there anything that could happen with a C-section that would prevent you from?
There are some. So C-sections can have some impact on fertility, although a single C-section would be sort of unlikely. People have many C-sections, then the sort of scarring aspects can make it more difficult to implant. But generally, with a single C-section, no, we would not. That would not probably play a role.
Got it. And if you have already had a child, are you less likely to have issues having a second, or is it kind of
because we've learned again? Sort of think about if we think of people as a sort of having a distribution. I'm drawing that's a normal distribution. Sort of a distribution of how fertile they are. Once we learn that you're able to have one kid, we have learned something about where you likely are in the distribution.
Right.
Now we haven't learned everything. But we've learned something about you. And so the chance that you are in a sort of more fertile part of the distribution has gone up.
Okay.
If you told me this person got pregnant easily 7 times in a row, I think we could say, okay, that person probably is very fertile. Mm-hmm. And we would maybe be more surprised if they had trouble on the 8th time, if they weren't.
Got it.
Up to the age issues. If you only have one draw from that, we should update a little bit, but not as much as if we had, 7.
Okay. And is there any truth to the idea of okay, if it took you a while to have your first, then by the second one, your body knows what to do?
That is not.
I've heard that a lot.
No, I mean, I think that's true for labor. Like and after you, like your body does, I think labor is easier typically the second time. Like, everything is stretched once before.
Okay.
You're kind of, you know more what to expect. So there's various reasons why the second baby is typically much faster to give birth, but that's different from the second pregnancy.
That's not true about the second pregnancy. Okay. So it's not like, oh, the second will be easier once you've figured out the first. Unless you're like, oh, I know what works for me in terms of now tracking.
Yeah, totally. Exactly. Like you've learned something about your own thing,
Yes.
but like the body part, no. It's like your brain that's learned or something.
So someone writes in, trying to conceive and terrified after preeclampsia with my first. Do you have any advice?
Preeclampsia comes in a lot of different forms. So it's characterized by high blood pressure, protein in the urine, and it's I want to acknowledge here, like this is a really scary complication because it really sort of almost pits mom against baby.
Interesting.
Because the cure for preeclampsia is delivery. And so if you develop preeclampsia, at term, like at 30, at or after 37 weeks, they just deliver the baby right away. And that's typically totally fine. If you develop preeclampsia at 28 weeks, then it's really a balance of, how long can we sort of keep mom stable while we wait, and we may have to deliver very early, too early for the baby, so it's like, I think that tension is so emotionally draining for families on top of just all of the sort of physical stuff. So I want to name why this is like, I totally hear this person's concern. The risk of reoccurrence of preeclampsia depends a lot on when it occurred in the first pregnancy. So if you have a sort of very early preeclampsia, the chance of recurrence is very high. If you have preeclampsia much later, the chance of reoccurrence is lower. One thing that I will say, there's like two, I think, reassuring pieces here. So one is we actually do have some treatment for preeclampsia. So this is why a lot of people are prescribed baby aspirin.
Okay.
There's good evidence that taking baby aspirin starting typically around 12 weeks of pregnancy lowers the risk of preeclampsia recurrence by about 20%. So, it's not 100% down, but that's a solid reduction in the risk.
So do they have everyone do that, or just people who are at risk of this?
At this point, if you have any risk factors for preeclampsia, which is basically almost everybody who is if you're over 35, if you're overweight, if you, conceived with almost
anyone with any sort
there's
of...
really no downsides to baby aspirin. So pretty much just everybody gets it.
Got it.
Or like a large share of people. And the other reassuring thing I would say to this person is because you now know what to expect, your doctor is going to be in a much better position to help you monitor this. So some of the sort of scariness of this diagnosis and what happens after will be lowered by at least knowing what to expect. But
right. You're not going to be shocked or surprised.
You're not going to be shocked.
Yes.
And, there is this baby aspirin stuff which can help.
Do you have any statistics on what % of infertility cases are unexplained? And, if you were given this diagnosis, what would you do with that information?
Yeah, so a large share, probably more than half of fertility is unexplained. If we sort of think about fertility as infertility as kind of being like 30% issues with mom, 30% issues with dad, 30% of, that doesn't add to 100, but
we don't know.
30
Yeah.
years of these sort of some combination. And even within those categories, there's a lot of unexplained nature. So we can understand a lot about sperm. Sperm kind of have one job. They need to have the right shape and swim. So we actually, once those things are either true or not true.
Okay.
There need to be some sperm. They need to have the right shape. They need to swim. That's basically
cut and dry.
Okay. Yeah. Within the sort of infertility associated with the woman, we have some sense of you can not have enough eggs. You could have an issue with the uterus, an issue with the fallopian tubes. Those are diagnosable. But there's a pretty large share even there where, we don't really know. And then the sort of combination part, we really don't know. So a lot of infertility ends up being just unexplained.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I've had this kind of thing too, where it's with a lot, I think for women in infertility, it's well, it could be this thing, but there's a lot of people, it could be endometriosis, but there's a lot of people who have endometriosis who have kids. Or it could be a uterine septum, but there's a lot of people who have that, so I think it kind of feels for the women, a lot of the time, it feels like a little bit of
we're sort of guessing.
We don't know, right?
And even we sort of say you need high quality eggs. Mm-hmm. We don't have any way to measure that, right? So we have these tests that measure how many eggs you have, and those can be helpful in telling you how successful IVF will be because it gives you some sense of what is the sort of likely yield from an IVF cycle.
Right.
But that's not a measure of quality. We don't have any measure of quality. There's no test you can do where you can be okay, what share of your eggs are going to be top shelf.
Right. I guess the only way to do that is to make them into embryos.
Only
and
way
then
to do that is
test
make them in
yeah.
embryos and test them. Exactly.
Right.
So there's no like ex ante way to say anything about your egg quality.
I guess unless you have multiple miscarriages, and then you would test those miscarriages, right? And if they
Yeah.
were normal, it might tell you the egg quality was probably fine. Right?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So there are a few things, but again, like for when people are often looking for like up, okay, I'm having trouble conceiving. Like up front, I want to know,
Right.
like, is it because of the quality of my eggs? It's like there's
There's no
one's gonna
way,
be able to tell you.
Yeah. So if one were diagnosed with that, like, I guess, what do you do with that information?
With unexplained infertility.
Yeah.
Generally, then you just do IVF. So
Okay.
a lot of, and I think this is a little tricky because if there are sort of a set of kind of diagnoses of infertility for which other interventions are like sort of lower lift interventions might work. So intrauterine insemination,
Okay.
which is like something that's called IUI, where you take the sperm and then you sort of stick it in and put it right near the cervix, or possibly stick it all the way in. That can be very helpful if the reason that you are struggling to conceive is, the sperm doesn't swim very well, or, well, mainly that, but a few other, or like there's some issues, blockages. And so there's like a few things where that can be a very effective solution. But for most things, or like a large share of unexplained infertility, basically the answer is just IVF is what we've got
Right.
on the table for that.
And speaking of IUI, I've heard like from certain doctors that like almost like people just do it for like insurance purposes, that
Yes.
like it's really not very effective, and it's almost just a way to
IUI can be very effective if you have a problem that is fixed by what IUI is doing.
getting the sperm close
Getting
to
the
the
sperm
cervix.
close to the cervix. If that's the problem, this system will fix it. A large amount of infertility is not about things that are getting the sperm so close to the cervix, in which case most of the reason people are doing this is because insurance needs you to go through some number of cycles of IUI before they give you the IVF clearance.
Right.
It is not ideal, because of course the faster you get to IVF, like in some sense the better, if that's what you're going to need.
What are your thoughts on using ChatGPT to talk more in depth about test results? Like just to use that as a tool to interpret things.
So people are using AI for a lot.
Yeah.
I think that there's two, and I think it can be an incredibly useful tool. I think there's a couple of cautions. So one is that, you're putting your personal medical information into a database that is used for training data. And so I would be careful about, putting in very detailed things about my personal self into, an AI that's going to be trained.
Remembering it. Yeah.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And the second piece of it is these models still have, and this is like a whole for other podcasts, but these models still have a lot of problems with hallucinations. And they they make things up.
Really?
Yeah. Okay. And ChatGPT wants to make you happy. Like they want to answer your question. Okay. That's like, it's like they've like programmed in this new personality that like really wants you to feel good about yourself. They want you to feel like it's answer your question.
That's so
and
funny.
So it will make they will make things up.
You think about Siri, who'll be like, I don't know that one. But
right. ChatGPT will not say that. Yeah, they'll be like, and it'll make things up and you'll be like, that's not right. And they'll be like, oh yeah, that's not right. It's like my 9-year-old, it's like, ah. So I think it can be a very helpful way to like this is a machine that knows a lot. And sometimes it can pick up, like there's interesting uses of AI for like picking up details of test results that might like link to something in something else that you wouldn't see otherwise, that maybe your doctor even wouldn't see. So I don't think it's a crazy thing to do. I'd be careful about my personal information. Okay. And I wouldn't like actually make any decisions based on the information I was given from ChatGPT. It's more of an idea generation process.
Okay. So you could take those, bring them to a real doctor
Exactly.
who can give you a more nuanced breakdown of that.
Yes.
All right. Note to self, an immediate, because I feel like people, I think we're in this world that we're in. You could see a test result in a portal before your doctor has seen it, and then immediately like doom scroll about your thing or ask ChatGPT.
I think personally, I think it would be best if the portal results did not show up before your doctor told you them. But I guess that's the system we have arrived at.
There's a lot of chatter saying that all pregnancy complications come from the man. Right? Is this true?
This is not true. Okay. All pregnancy complications do not come from the man. I'm not. Yeah, I mean, it's the last time. I just don't even know where this came from, and it is not. It's just not. It's not right. A lot of pregnancy complications, unfortunately, do come from mom.
Right. Well, I mean, I think there's more factors with the mom,
you're
right?
the one who's having, they're like, this is very physically draining on your body, like making another person. You know, you make a whole organ, right? Like the placenta is the only example where like, it's the only example of like an organ shared between two people. It's shared, like you and the baby each make half of it.
Wow.
And it's like a whole organ that like controls all of your hormones and all of the aspects of your body. And you like make it all yourself. And then it's discarded at the end.
And that's the placenta?
Yeah.
Wow.
The placenta is really cool.
I've seen some stuff about like scientists creating an embryo and then like sort of harvesting it to a certain phase in a pod.
Right.
Like to the idea that maybe in the future we could
grow people in pods.
Yes, instead of in
I don't know how far we've gotten on that.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like something that's going to happen tomorrow, but it was very interesting.
Yes, there's like a lot of ethical questions about how far you want to push the embryonic development before. Anyway, it's for a different day.
A little matrix. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. A little matrix like.
Is there a correlation between miscarriage and endometriosis?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you know like what is it a high statistic? Because again, that's one of those things you hear. Oh, there's plenty of women who.
There are plenty of women. I don't know how high this correlation is. Okay. Like with many, issues, sort of uterine related issues, there are going to be an increased risk. But it is also true that a lot of people with endometriosis get pregnant.
Right. So it's one of those things where it's like
things.
could be that, could be something else.
Exactly.
I've also seen a lot of this stuff on TikTok about ureaplasma. Have you heard about this?
I haven't even heard of that.
It's like a bacterial infection that like they don't test people for, that you have like some people on Instagram being like, I struggled with infertility for years. And then like finally I asked my doctor to test for ureaplasma and like they cured it. And that was my issue.
I've never even heard of this.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I guess TikTok's a lie.
Maybe not.
Needs to
I have to look into it. Okay, I have it on my list.
How would you use the data, hypothetically, use the data to decide if something is just bad luck versus an issue worth finding, interventions?
I think the general way you want to approach the data is to ask a question like, how much have I learned about what's true of me and about sort of what's going to happen in the future based on this event?
Okay.
And so to take like miscarriage as an example, which is probably a sort of salient example in this, if I have one miscarriage and you think about how much have I learned from that, the answer is a little bit, but not very much. So given how common miscarriage is, like the increased risk of having another miscarriage, there's a little bit of an increase after one, but it's not very big. And I think from that, I would say, look, this is very, very likely just bad luck. I haven't learned very much from it. And so it isn't something that should spur me to do something. The second miscarriage, then, after having 2 losses in the first trimester, the risk of another one does go up. Somewhat substantially. Again, not to 100%. I'm not saying but it is higher than it was otherwise. And that's the point in which I think you want to say, okay, like, what have I learned? Let me pursue a little bit. Is there something else I should do? Something I should change having learned, with this additional information. I think a similar point could be made about, say, IVF cycles. So I think a lot of people, you have one, and it doesn't work. The question of like, what should I learn from that? There, I think it is probably the case that you want to try to learn from every single one, because of course, some of it is that, sometimes it's luck, but you don't get an infinite number, you don't get a million IVF cycles. So even though I think it is very hard, and for many people, talk to people who struggle with this, there's this feeling of like, it didn't work. Let's get back on the train. Like, let me do another cycle right away. I don't want to take the time to sort of step back and reflect on this because it's very hard to do that. But there is real value there in stepping back and saying, have I learned anything from this? And maybe the answer will be no. Maybe actually we sort of did everything. It all looked great. Just it didn't work.
Yeah.
But maybe you have learned something, and opening up yourself to even the hard conversation about like, what have I learned from this? Mm-hmm. That's quite important for making good decisions.
Yeah, almost like approaching it like a scientist would.
Yeah.
Right. And what is the new information I got from this cycle? That, what are the variables I changed? What can we do going forward knowing that?
Yeah, and I think that's the way you put that is like almost exactly how I might put it to a doctor, right? Rather than, what did I do? What did we do wrong? Or, why did this happen? Which is like not a very precise way to put it, to sort of say, what have we learned from this? And is that something that we should take to change something next time?
Right. And I think that attitude, although it feels like a little cold or a little like removed from it, I actually think that if you can take that out of it, it does make it feel like, okay, like it doesn't feel like every cycle is like a waste, or every
Right.
failed attempt is a waste. You can look at it as almost like every cycle is something where I learned new information about the way that I'm doing this.
Exactly. Yeah. It's very hard though.
Let's get into the IVF questions.
Let's get into
what
IVF.
Everyone wants to
Yeah.
know. We touched on this a little bit as it pertained to regular conception, but in terms of IVF, are supplements all a waste? And is there anything that I can do to improve, the person writes, to improve fertility outcomes?
Right. So I should first say on Parent Data, I'm going to be aping here a lot of Dr. Brenna Slocum, who wrote some amazing stuff for us.
Okay.
Supplements. There's really no good evidence for the supplements that people are told to take during this period. Pretty much, yeah. I mean, you should take some folic acid. This is always true. You're trying to conceive.
Right.
People should be taking folic acid. A lot of women are anemic and should have some iron. Need some vitamin C to absorb the iron. None of these things have to do with IVF. These are just like things that women who are trying to conceive may consider to be a nice thing to take. And that's basically kind of it.
Okay.
And all of these other supplements, to increase your egg quality, like even that, so much of this is framed as like increase your egg quality. We don't have any way to measure egg quality. Like that isn't something that you can get as an outcome. So anybody who told you like people took this supplement and we measured their egg quality, it was better, is lying because we don't know how to measure egg quality. So
Right.
that's
so speaking specifically, just like it starts with the egg. You're saying a lot of that is not. It's sort of anecdotal.
It's sort of anecdotal, yes.
Right.
And so, are these supplements going to hurt people? Really not going to hurt you, except that they're often very expensive, and they may get in the way of some of this real learning that people want to do. So there's just not a lot of evidence for supplements.
Which is interesting because I feel like a lot of doctors will recommend them or say them. And do you think that's more to like give patients a sense of them being able to control something?
There's a really nice piece by a doctor that I read a few months ago, which is about like why do we give people this advice about supplements, in the infertility context when it doesn't work. And I think it is. I mean, his view was it's really like, we want to tell people, we want there to be something that people can do. And this isn't hard. Like this isn't harmful.
It's like the placebo effect. Almost,
it's like the placebo effect. The placebo effect's like a real thing. This is more just like
it's worse than the placebo.
It's like a mental health support almost. Like we want to help people feel better and feel like they're doing something. And this is something we can tell them to do that like definitely feels like you're doing a thing. You're paying a bunch of money for this stuff and you're taking it every day.
It's like making your bed.
It's like making your bed and it's not going to hurt. So why not tell them? And I think of course the counter argument there is, well, then are people going to blame themselves when they don't get pregnant or they didn't take it at the right time? I skipped it. I missed a day of my, fancy supplement. And like, that's why the cycle didn't work.
Right. So do you think there actually is anything that you can do to improve IVF outcomes or egg retrievals or IVF transfers or anything like that?
There is certainly a lot of variation across, say, providers in how successful they are at this. So I definitely believe that there may be, people who are better and worse at doing this.
Okay. So like choosing the right doctor,
having the doctor sort of like grade the embryos correctly. Like, well, how are they doing? Like, there's a lot of like doing of the IVF, which it seems like there must be variation in how good people are at doing that.
Okay.
And there are other things that are going to impact the success of IVF, like the age of your eggs and, how many do you have and all that kind of stuff. But that's
control.
Those are not really in your control.
So it seems like the best thing you can do is just do your research to find a high quality doctor and that works with a high quality lab.
Exactly.
That's something.
Yeah, which is definitely something. Asking them about, what do their success rates look like? What do their success rates look like for people like you? I think that's like probably an overlooked issue, which of course, like if I am, if I were a reproductive endocrinologist and I wanted to have the best IVF success rate possible, the thing I would do is have a bunch of patients whose issue is like they have a blocked fallopian tube.
Right.
And they're 32. That's like that person is like a real high chance of success because there's no problems with their eggs. There's probably no problems with the sperm. The problem is definitely something that can be fixed by putting the embryo right in the uterus.
I mean, that's a good point because I've spoken to many fertility clinics and, I have embryos, but some of them will say, well, we'll only take your embryos if they're this great.
Exactly.
And so like, and their rates of success are really good, but are their rates of success really good because they're only taking these embryos?
Yes.
Right.
And so if you're a person who's 42 and has, some lower grade embryos that you want to implant, and the fertility clinic has had a lot of success with 32-year-olds with grade 8 AA embryo, whatever, you're not going to learn that much from that. So I think asking the clinic, what does your success look like with someone with my profile?
Have you seen this? Have you seen a case like mine before?
Have you seen a
what
case
have you
like mine
done
before?
to
Exactly
overcome that? That's a great point. In terms of embryo transfers and implantation, is there what would actually interfere with that? What would cause issues with implantation?
If your uterus, implantation requires, the embryo to find its way to the right part of the uterus. And so issues with the uterus can affect implantation. And just sometimes it doesn't implant.
Right. Well, is that due to genetic, what I mean? They say
there's just there's an element of randomness there that it just, sometimes it doesn't.
It seems, because that's the kind of thing where it feels they have this method, and I think they say 60 to 70% of all the embryos implant, and if they're genetically tested, you're like, well, why isn't it
100%? Yeah, it's because it just the human body is like a hot, confusing mess, right? You put the thing in there, you're hoping it's going to find the wall to implant, but sometimes it doesn't.
Well, it's interesting. Someone I had told me that it was very interesting that human reproduction pretty inefficient.
So inefficient.
When you compare ourselves to I just got a puppy from a litter of 7 puppies, right? They're and it just feels to get one can feel such a obstacle course. And someone was saying it's almost only due to our brains that we can even do this, that we haven't died out, because something about, and tell me if this is true, he said something about how because we're standing, that's something about that makes it less efficient because you're not on 4 legs and you're standing, and that makes it harder to carry a child.
I think the fact that we are standing up, so my understanding of this is that the standing nature of our need to walk standing like this has necessitated a pelvis of a certain size.
Okay.
And the sort of evolutionary tension is that really ideally the brain would be bigger when you were born. Okay. So then you would not be such a floppy mess for so many years. Right. But unfortunately, if the brain were any bigger, it couldn't get out. And so we've evolved to a place where the brain is almost too big, but most of the time not too big, but sometimes too big, which is why, of course, in the past, maternal mortality was so high. Right. It still is too high, but for different reasons. And so basically we're the sort of standing up is the reason birth is so difficult, and is partly the reason that infant mortality, all of this stuff is very complicated.
So it is due to our big brains.
It is due to our big brains, but I'm not sure
helpful.
The conception piece of that is I'm not sure it's the conception piece so much as
Well, it sounds like our brains are helping and hurting because they're helping us come up with C-section technology.
Right. And but also getting in the way of being born.
Right. Yes.
What a time
if
to be alive. If we were giraffes, it would just fall right out, but also no C-sections.
But you also think about that, a giraffe standing up and walking, within probably, a couple days?
Yeah. I think it's almost immediately. Yeah. I think the giraffe baby drops out. I don't think giraffes lay down to give birth. I think they just drop it.
And keep walking, right?
Yeah, and then the baby kind of catches up.
No maternity leave.
Don't quote me on this. Okay. I'm not a giraffe birth expert.
You're not doing statistics there?
That's in giraffes.
One other question was, how effective is IVF? And I assume this depends on many other factors.
Yeah. So I think it's sort of the simplest number to say is, if you have a genetically normal, euploid, we say euploid embryo that you're implanting, the success rate's 60 to 70%.
Okay.
So that's pretty good. And then you're sort of backing out from there, what is the chance that you get a genetically sort of a high grade genetically sort of typical embryo out of a given IVF cycle, and that is going to depend on how many eggs you get, how much they're fertilized, and so the sort of success rate varies a lot with what you come into the cycle with.
Which makes it so hard to be Googling IVF success rates when it's all once you get into a little bit of a more complicated pregnancy, it's so much more important, your individual factors. Right?
Yeah, and then there are questions people use donor eggs. And the success rates can be really high with donor eggs because you're getting an egg from someone who is much younger.
Right.
And then you're kind of working with a very different set than your own egg structure.
And how many eggs would you say is like a good number?
So there's eggs and then there's embryos. And again, you want to like back out. So if you want, 3 embryos, how many
3 embryos is what they say, like, well, most likely, I think there's a 90% chance of a live birth.
Right.
from
And
3
that's sort of
embryos.
because that's like multiplying out this, like, what's the chance of conception with each of these embryos. But how many eggs you need to get to that is going to depend a lot on like how many of the eggs are chromosomally normal. And so this is sort of like more is better.
More is more.
More is
yeah.
more.
But is there a case like with PCOS where like more is not necessarily more? Like if you have PCOS, you're more likely to have a lot more eggs. But does it matter about egg quality? Does that affect egg quality?
Egg quality, but egg quality is a lot. It's just going to be about chromosomes and about your age.
Okay. So there's ways to test for that. Okay. And why don't doctors why do they advise against transferring more than one embryo?
Because twin pregnancies are complicated.
Okay.
And so, I think it used to be before we did a lot of embryo testing, like for chromosomal issues, the sort of chance that any given embryo has a chromosomal problem is like reasonably high. And so if you sort of said, okay, well, only like chromosomally normal pregnancies are going to implant. So we're going to put 2 in because we don't know, like, and maybe half of them are not normal. So we kind of in expectation, we get 1. Now that we're in a position where it's much, much more common to be testing embryos at either day 3 or day 5 and sort of having some sense of like we're implanting embryos, we have a much higher confidence are genetically normal. They don't want to implant 2 because twins are complicated. Okay. Like the risk of preterm birth is, many people carry twins totally fine, but the risk of preterm birth is higher and there's other risks for mom.
And I think I've seen this in popular culture, this notion that like IVF medications are bad for you. Like, or imbalance
lead to
your
cancer
hormones,
or whatever.
lead to cancer, lead to other issues, lead to other stuff. Is there any evidence?
We really
of
don't
that?
have much evidence for that. No, we have like all of that would be correlational.
And do you have any data about like if a person miscarries during more than 3 transfers or more than 3 transfers don't work? What is the likelihood of each subsequent transfer not working?
We don't have a lot of detailed data about things like sort of that exact question. Back to the sort of question of what do you learn? You have learned something there. Maybe it is 3 times bad luck in a row, but it's also the case that like if you think about, if you said, we've 3 times we've implanted a genetically normal, embryo and the chance of implantation is, 60 to 70%, you're at about 90% chance that one of those things would have worked. Now you're in the 10%. So you're in the 10%, that's still 10%, still, some reasonable chance that if you did it again, you would get success, but you have learned something. And so I think that's like an opportunity to talk to the doctor about like, have we learned something? What do we want to do as the next step?
If the uterus doesn't age, then what is the reason to implant? Let's say you have frozen embryos from a younger age. Is there any sort of like impetus to use those embryos sooner rather than later, or could you use them at 48 and it wouldn't matter?
You can use them at 48 from the standpoint of the embryos, but as you age, things get more complicated. So some of there are pregnancy risks which go up over time. Things like preeclampsia or gestational diabetes. Like there's a bunch of things where the potential complications basically coming from like mom's physiology are increasing over time just because you're older and you're at higher risk for hypertension and the things that come with that.
With age, yeah.
With age. And so it's like it's not the age of the embryos. The embryos are just frozen. They're just unaged. But you haven't unaged. And so I think that's the reason why, there could be an impetus to sort of move more quickly, even if the embryos are frozen, although certainly less than if you were using the current eggs.
I think that's really helpful. Those are all our user submitted questions. I know we didn't cover like half of what entails IVF, and I know that they can find so much more information on parentdata.org. You have a reproductive endocrinologist on there who's also answering these questions, probably from a medical standpoint, a little more like specifically. On there.
And we have like a lot of like really in the weeds. So we have another reproductive endocrinologist, Colby Hancock, who wrote like what I think I was just reading it last night in preparation for this, like a really detailed thing on embryo grading. So if you're like, they're gonna like, I'm gonna see this embryo grades and the number's like 811 or 8PF. She's got like this incredible detail about what all of those things mean.
Really?
Which, if you're in it, this is one of the more confusing aspects. So having like some background so you understand when they give you some numbers on this, thing that comes up in your portal that no one's told you about, you can actually understand the numbers. You don't even have to ask ChatGPT. So
that's great. I mean, there's a lot, it's funny. There's so much information on the internet. And what I love about what you do is that you really fully go into the data and you're getting a really high level response to things that, again, there's so many different opinions on, there's so many different options on. So I love what you're doing. I think it's great for the community that's trying to get pregnant, the community that's having issues getting pregnant, and all, even all sorts of other people who are trying to conceive in all sorts of different ways that are more niche or not. There's really not that much information for the more niche you get in this space. So I think it's amazing what you're doing.
Thank you. Thanks for putting it out there and let me tell people about it.
Of course. And we'll be back next time on Baby Steps.